The following program is brought to you by the University of Alabama.
Although the world will always associate Winston Groom with the now classic Forrest Gump, it has been 29 years and 11 books since that 1986 novel. Groom has established a solid reputation as a military historian, and his latest is The Aviators, extended discussions of Charles Lindbergh, Eddie Rickenbacker, and Jimmy Doolittle. These are stories of daring, Doolittle's raid on Tokyo, Lindbergh's Atlantic solo flight, but also intimate biographies of heroes we only thought we knew about. I spoke with Winston Groom in the Fairhope Museum of History in Fairhope, Alabama. Winston, it's good to see you again.
As well.
It's always fun to come down to Fairhope and interview you on your home turf.
Yes, you are. I'm glad to say.
You've been here a long time. When you moved back to Alabama, did you move directly down to Fairhope, to Point Clear?
Yes.
30 years ago?
I think, it was about 30 years ago I started coming back to see my father, who was in his 80s then. Mother had died, and he lived in Mobile, but I'd come back, and we used to have a home over here, and I'd come back and get a place, and I kept staying longer and longer each year. And I finally realized, why in the heck am I living in New York when I like it so much down here?
Ah.
I cut the umbilical cord, put myself on parole.
Right. Yeah, you did the right thing. Very pleasant. Over the years, I mean, I've been reading your books one at a time as they come out, and the years go by faster than you and I can talk. Since the last time we sat down, I think you've written 5 books, published 5 books, all of them about war in one fashion or another. And most of your war books, although you have an 1812 book, you have a First World War book, you have a Second World War book, you have a Mexican War book.
Yeah. Civil War book.
But you have a lot of Civil War books. You have the Shiloh, and you have Vicksburg, and you had the Nashville Shrouds of Glory, Shrouds of Glory, way back when.
That's it.
I remember when Ken Burns put the Civil War really into everyone's head with the big documentary on the Civil War. At the end of it, he had his experts, which included Shelby Foote, sit down and in one long session, generalize, summarize what should we take away from all this study of the Civil War. And I'll tell you what Shelby Foote said. He said that the Confederate soldiers came to realize that Yankee soldiers were not cowards, that they would fight. And apparently they hadn't thought that.
That's right.
You've written, I know you have a library of Civil War material, and you've written several books about the Civil War. If somebody from an unknown planet were here to ask you, what do you know? What should I know about the Civil War? What did you conclude? What are the big generalizations?
Well, I think it would be that the South was too damn sure of itself. They hopped into that thing with the idea that they were going to win it and win it fast, and they didn't think it through. It was a highly irrational, emotional decision to go to war. And they made every logistical mistake you could possibly make over the years.
What I took away from, well, absolutely from Vicksburg, but more even at Shiloh and the fighting in Tennessee and around Nashville, was the slaughter of it all. Southerners can count. Didn't the Confederate Army know that they couldn't lose 10,000 people a day and keep at it?
They didn't think about that. They thought they were going to win it and win it quick. That wasn't. It was like the Japanese in World War II. The Japanese, they understood they couldn't fight a war of attrition. They had to win it fast, and in doing that, they would fight battles, and the South would do the same thing that most commanders would not even want to lose a man in, and they would lose 2,000 men in it. They were determined to push forward and win quickly.
Well, they would run out of soldiers.
Run out of manpower.
They would. They had to, but people knew that.
But nobody expected. Nobody. I think if you read the letters in the newspapers, the literature of the day, nobody ever expected that thing to go on at the length that it did.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I'd say it. I think in Vicksburg, one of those books that I think that actually was Vicksburg. That's when the war should have ended. That's when the South should have sued for peace with Lincoln, and instead they went ahead and fought for 2 more years. And the worst part of the war was those last 2 years.
In Vicksburg, I remember you saying, if the South had realized at the end of that siege that the war should end, there would have been saved 600,000 lives?
I don't know if it's
something like
that many, but probably half of that at least. I mean, they didn't. Vicksburg and Gettysburg both ended in defeats for the South on the same day, which is the 4th of July of 1863.
Oh.
And that's when Lee pulled out of Gettysburg, and that's when the Confederates surrendered Vicksburg. And if they, of course, they would have had to have a lot of foresight, but I think they would have gotten a lot better deal from Abraham Lincoln had they tried to have a peace then than they did 2 years later when there wasn't any more Abraham Lincoln.
Right, but there was Grant and Sherman.
There was
they
Grant and Sherman,
knew
for sure.
what to do. The meat grinders.
That's right, and they understood that kind of war. It was a big industrial war.
The South entered the war, and I'm taking this from books of yours, books and books. South entered the war and apparently did not have a gunpowder manufacturing plant or a place where they made rifles or anything of that. But
as Rhett Butler famously said, you don't even have a cannon factory.
And they didn't. They,
not when they started, but they caught up reasonably fast.
Right.
The problem, they didn't run out of gunpowder or cannons, or as you pointed, they ran out of first leadership. I mean, all the officers were killed, and the second tier of officers was not as good as the first tier of officers. Mm-hmm. Then they started running out of food, and they started running out of men, and that, speaks for itself.
Yeah, the food thing in Vicksburg, I learned something that I really, really had not run across before in the book on Vicksburg, which was that Southerners apparently didn't grow anything you could eat. They grew cotton.
They didn't do a very good job of it. They thought the war was going to be over, and the cotton was king. It was cash, big cash. Tomatoes and things like that were not.
No.
And so some farmers did grow what they call truck crops, but the majority of these people went right back to planting cotton.
Yeah. So the food was coming from the 3 Confederate states that were across the river.
Yes.
And when Vicksburg was lost, the supply.
But also when Vicksburg, during the siege of Vicksburg, there was no food, period.
Yeah.
And the city was reduced to a diet of rats. And they say the only people that liked that were the Louisianans, those soldiers. They seemed to find a way to cook them. They were the Louisiana Brigade was encamped in a cane patch, cane brake, and they managed to figure out that you could eat the little hearts of the cane like the Chinese do. Whatever that bamboo shoots. They eat that. They eat anything.
Perfectly useful skill at the time. But you've gone on, and you have the World War II book, the book on the early in the war, and now the Aviators. The newest book is the Aviators. The 3 remarkable men, Doolittle,
Lindbergh,
Charles Lindbergh, and Rickenbacker, and it is an amazing collection of heroes. generally speaking, you have these three guys. They're all fantastically famous. They're all international celebrities. They all won the Congressional Medal of Honor. But they're not alike. But what traits did you, as you moved through their three biographies, what do these guys have in common that put them all in the same place?
They really didn't have a lot in common other than spatial. I mean, they all grew up as basically World War I era men. And although Rickenbacker was the only one who got over to Europe, where of course he won the congressional, he was ace of aces and very, very famous when he came back. And Lindbergh got in the year after the war, I believe, 1919. And Doolittle was so good a pilot, they made him an instructor. But these guys, aviation was at a very, very basic level at that point. And these guys were truly aviators. They wanted to improve the condition of the craft. And they did, each one of them. In Lindbergh's case, of course, he flew across the Atlantic, proved that could be done, and designed a plane to do it. Doolittle was really, he had so many things. He was the first man to do an outside loop. He had his PhD from MIT. He got through the Army. Most people don't know that about him. And in college, he worked his way through the University of California as a professional boxer.
He was a poor kid, wasn't he?
He was
of the three.
All of them were poor. Right? Lindbergh was the only one who was marginally middle class. His father ultimately went broke, so he couldn't afford to keep him in college, but he flunked out anyway. But, these guys, Rickenbacker promoted aviation by owning airlines. He founded and owned Eastern Airlines. Doolittle, the main problem with aviation until 1929 was that they simply, they couldn't fly in fog, heavy rains, night. You didn't have any instrument flying. And Doolittle, because he was a graduate of MIT and a true scientist, got with the Guggenheim Foundation, and they literally developed a course in which, after it was finished with all these instruments, Doolittle one day got up, and it was a fog on Long Island, and he'd been waiting for this for months and months, and he got into one of these biplanes, and they rolled a big canvas hood over his cockpit, and he taxied and he took off and he flew around for about 30 miles and landed that plane back without ever looking at anything but the controls in front of him. And that was the beginning of modern aviation, because then they could have a schedule. You couldn't even have a schedule when you don't know if you're going to be able to fly or not. And that's and all those instruments are the ones they have today, except for the highly computerized ones, all derived from those instruments that he had developed.
Right. He became the equivalent in fame. He was as famous as Lindbergh after the raid, though.
Oh gosh!
I mean, that is a remarkable sequence, taking off from the carrier Hornet and flying over Japanese homeland.
I think it was one of the bravest things that was ever done in that war. I mean, he himself, Doolittle, gave it less than a 50% chance of surviving it. And all those fellows, they were reserve outfit from out in Washington. And he gave them a chance over and over. If you don't want to do this, tell me now, and nobody will say a word. And not one of them balked at it. They all went.
They flew over Japan too. They didn't. There was no getting back to the Hornet.
And they flew over Japan hours earlier than they'd anticipated. It was supposed to be a night raid. They wound up, because they had to take off early, they'd been spotted, a day raid, and then they wound up over their landing site in China at night instead of during the daytime in a big rainstorm. And they had each one of them flew their bombers until it ran out of gas, and then they all bailed out over mostly Japanese-held territory. And
in China.
In China, and the Chinese collected them and brought them back to the U.S. lines, and most of them survived. The Japanese caught several, and they executed several, and there were several who were killed by the parachute fall, but I think 90% got that back.
I have two questions that come out of the aviation book. One is, at least two of these fellas were very reluctant to get involved with World War II. Lindbergh was anti-interventionist,
He was.
and so was Doolittle?
No.
Rickenbacker.
Doolittle's Rickenbacker.
All right. And the other question that combines with this is, as World War I established, fighting in the air at all, there it was. And then all the 20s and all the 30s. But nobody seemed to believe in air power. Now, people don't seem to believe in anything else. Everything is going to be done.
Well, after the war, you need only to look at the photographs of the ruined cities of Europe or Japan to know what air power can do. It's tremendous. But these guys, I tell you, they were, over half the country was not for getting into the war until the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor. They just felt like the Europeans, we just lost 100,000 men over there in World War I, and they're going to go at it again and expect us to come save their bacon. And so what in Lindbergh's case, what I found interesting was Roosevelt, Lindbergh's a very well-known person, and Roosevelt took away his colonel's commission in the Army. He was a colonel. And when the war came, he wouldn't give it back. And so Lindbergh, he said, I'm not going to sit here and stay out of this thing. So he got a job with the only man who would give him a job, which was Henry Ford, because even Roosevelt wouldn't mess with Henry Ford. And Ford ran the biggest airplane plant in the world up there at Willow Run. And Doolittle became essentially a test pilot and did very dangerous things. And then he said, in 1944, early 44, he said, I have done all I can do testing these planes under these conditions. I need to go out and test them under the battle conditions.
Yeah.
And they let him do it. And here at the age of, I think he was 43 or 44, when every other pilot was in their early 20s, he went first to Guadalcanal and flew Corsairs with the Marines, and then he went to New Guinea, and he flew P-38s with MacArthur's force. He shot down a Jap Zero. He was nearly shot down himself.
Right.
He put in more hours than the Army required, and the pilots loved him. He was like a god to them.
Yeah, you said he flew 50 missions. This fellow didn't want the war at all.
That's right.
And he ended up.
Well, he didn't want just any war. He just didn't
Right.
want that war. He thought
Right.
that it was going to be ruinous to everybody. But Rickenbacker, another case, he volunteered. They offered him a major generalcy, and he turned it down. He said, I don't want anything to do with the military. I want to do this on my own. But he was a secret courier to take highly classified messages out to the different commands when it became necessary. And they asked him, the Secretary of War asked him to take a message to MacArthur, who was in New Guinea, to tell him that the Allies were about to invade North Africa. And on the way to New Guinea, in the middle of the Pacific, Rickenbacker's B-17 got lost and crashed at sea. And there were, I think, 9 guys. One died, one was badly injured. And they survived for 26 days on these little life raft where when one guy turns over, everybody's got to turn over. It's like that kind of thing. And the way he actually did that was, after about the 8th day, they had no food and no water. And all of a sudden, a seagull landed on Rickenbacker's head. And he, you could imagine all eyes were on him in a raft, and the sharks were swimming around the raft. Well, he snatched that seagull up, they plucked him, and they ate him right on the spot. But they saved the entrails for bait.
Ah.
And then they could fish. But they got in storms, they got in just sort of dreadful things, and they were just at their last extremity when they were found, mainly because of Rickenbacker's wife, who had been told by Hap Arnold, the head of the Air Force, that we had searched for 2 weeks. This is all the Air Force searches for. And he said she came down to Washington on the train from New York and almost chewed the ribbons off my uniform. And he said, all right, another week. And they was just as they were about to drift through the last string of islands, they were spotted. And then he took a week off, and he got back in his clothes and he went to see MacArthur and told him his message.
Well, it still was
These were
plenty
remarkable.
of.
They were remarkable guys.
They were. Well, just the airplane accident that
in Atlanta.
Rickenbacker.
Yes,
Doolittle.
Rickenbacker. This is one of
Broke every
Rickenbacker's
every bone in his body except his right arm.
Oh yeah, it was horrible. I mean, his eyeball popped out. Everything. It was a big. It was a DC-3 crash in one of his Eastern Airline planes, and outside of Atlanta, it went through a grove of pine trees, and half of them survived. The other half were killed, but it took him a year to just get back where he could walk properly.
Charles Lindbergh was, I mean, of all, if you were charting in a kind of making a graph of Lindbergh, I mean, he was the most famous, probably most loved person in the world when he landed in Paris.
Yeah.
Perfectly famous. Then the most empathized person in the world when his child was kidnapped and lost. I mean, the whole world was worried about his, and quite, concerned, empathetic. Then he displays, he hates Roosevelt. He's reluctant to go to World War II, and he shows some pretty strong traces of anti-Semitism.
Yeah.
And suddenly he's one of the most loathed persons
That's right.
in the world. And he's this man of great virtue and integrity. When I got to the end of your book, I'm reading along, and it says he had several simultaneous families.
Yeah.
What was that?
I don't know what to make of it.
He had two or three wives?
He had 3 wives. One was a Bavarian hat maker, and one was a socialite, and one did something else, I forgot which, but he supported them all through the latter part of life, because his wife was having affairs too. She had an affair with a very famous French fly, and then she had an affair with a psychiatrist that she's going to see about what was wrong with Lindbergh.
Right.
And so, I mean, it was all, everybody was doing it. I mean, but,
But she wasn't, but she didn't marry. She wasn't married to 3 men at the same time.
No, she didn't. She wasn't. That made him a bigamist. But I don't. In any case, nobody knew what to make of it. They asked one of his daughters, I believe, was asked finally by the press, what can you make of this? I mean, everybody was, and Gretchen was shocked, and she said, I don't know except to say that no one woman could have stood to be with him all the time.
Well, her books are so sort of pious, I think, that Anne Morrow.
They're very well written.
Yeah, but they're just mountains of virtue.
Yeah.
And she and Charles were very busy folks.
He had an aura of sanctity about him.
Yeah.
That he would never do such a thing. I mean, he was a god. He could have had any different woman in the world he wanted at that point, but he chose not to. And she was the same way. I mean, but it just shows you expect the unexpected.
And what was that funny line? I think it was either Rickenbacker or Doolittle. Somebody asked, "Do you have affairs?" And,
Rickenbacker.
What did he say?
He said, "I don't have time. I never had time." And nobody's proven him wrong yet.
Yeah. I mean, these guys. I aside from the military dimensions to it all, I was really educated. I mean, one of them discovers what kind of octane airplanes should use.
Well, I think Doolittle really, he went over and sold the British on using 100 octane fuel. And the Germans were using, I think, either 78 or 80, somewhere like that. And that gave the British fighters a decided edge in those big Rolls-Royce engines they were using over the Germans. And in the Battle of Britain, I don't know that Britain would have been conquered. It probably would have been if they had Germans had destroyed the British Air Force. There was nothing to keep them from crossing the Channel. But the minister of something, petroleum or something in Great Britain said after the war that Jimmy Doolittle was the cause of the winter of the Battle of Britain.
And Lindbergh made suggestions for extending
miles
per gallon.
He got 600 or 800 more miles out of those planes in New Guinea, which allowed, MacArthur was using the P-38 fighters to escort the bombers on his island hopping all the way to the Philippines and then Japan. And that extra distance that they could get out of that because of Lindbergh tinkering with the fuel mixture allowed them, the fighters, to go along with the bombers and protect them. Which is good. But you know, well, we might as well get around to him and these affairs. He had an affair, apparently, with some model in New York, and she had said she wanted him to buy a fur coat, and so she was blackmailing him, and he decided he was going to just tell his wife. He told his wife, and his wife apparently forgave him, but she wrote the model in New York saying, "He never gave me a fur coat. What makes you think he's going to give you one?"
Well, when you're the most famous people in the world, I guess there are bound to be some kind of benefits. Winston, unbelievably, we have less than a minute, but I'm curious about what you're up to now and what are we going to look for next?
Well, I'm just about to finish a book called The Soldiers, which is modeled after the aviators, and it's about Douglas MacArthur, General George Patton, and General George Marshall. And they were similar to the aviators. They were all World War I era guys who did their big deal in World War II, and they're fascinating characters.
And if it goes well,
I'm going to do the sailors.
Sailors.
Admiral Nimitz and Admiral Halsey and Admiral King.
Well, I believe it. I believe there will be the soldiers, and I believe there will be the sailors, and it won't be long either. You're a hard-working man. It's nice to see you again.
Always my pleasure.
It's been a pleasure.